The smell of burnt sugar always brings me back to the moment I died. But right now, all I smell is my sister's expensive jasmine perfume, sickeningly sweet in the stuffy parlor. She is on her knees, sobbing, begging not to marry the monster of the Hayes family. In my last life, I took her place out of duty and paid with my blood. This time, I sip my lukewarm tea, watch her carefully manufactured tears, and smile. I'll do it. The teacup rattled against the saucer. It was a subtle sound, just a faint clink, clink, clink. But in the heavy silence of the living room, it might as well have been a gunshot. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer physical shock of being alive. My lungs pulled in air. It tasted like dust motes and lemon polish. A minute ago, or a lifetime ago, my mouth had tasted like copper. I remembered the slick, wet heat of my own blood pooling on the asphalt, the crushing weight of the twisted metal, the absolute, terrifying isolation of dying alone in the rain while my husband was at a gala with his mistress. Yet, here I was. The floral wallpaper of my childhood home was exactly as I remembered it. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked off the seconds. "I can't do it, Mother. I can't." Chloe's voice was a high, thin wail that grated against my eardrums. She was draped over the velvet armchair, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders heaved. It was a masterful performance. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was in agony. But I knew the angle of her elbows, the way she kept her face carefully shielded so she wouldn't ruin her mascara. She wasn't crying. She was negotiating. My mother, Beatrice, wrung her hands, her knuckles white. She looked at my father, who was staring out the window, a cigar clamped between his teeth, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. We needed the Hayes family's money. Our shipping business was a month away from bankruptcy, and Gideon Hayes had offered a buyout disguised as a dowry. He wanted Chloe. She was the beautiful one, the vibrant one, the one who photographed well for the society pages. "Chloe, darling, be reasonable," Mother pleaded, her voice cracking. She reached out to stroke Chloe's hair. "He's not a monster. He's just strict and very wealthy. He broke a man's jaw at the country club last week," Chloe snapped, her head snapping up. There it was, dry eyes, just as I suspected. "He's cold. He's cruel. He looks at people like they're insects. I love Colin. I won't give him up for that. That sociopath. Colin, a smooth-talking amateur investor with a fake Rolex and a charming smile. In my past life, Chloe ran away with him the night before the wedding. My parents, terrified of Gideon's wrath, had shoved me into her wedding dress. I had been terrified. I had cried. I had begged. But I had gone to the altar, a sacrificial lamb, hoping my obedience would buy me some sliver of affection from the man waiting there. It hadn't. Gideon despised weakness. He had looked at me standing there, in a dress tailored for my sister, shivering and pale, and he had seen nothing but an inconvenience. The next 5 years were a masterclass in psychological starvation. He didn't hit me. He just erased me. "Nora," my father's voice was a low gravel. He finally turned from the window. His eyes settled on me, sitting quietly in the corner. I was the plain sister, the quiet one, the one who wore Chloe's cast-offs and managed the household accounts. "Nora," he said again, heavier this time, "talk to your sister." He wanted me to convince her, or, failing that, He was preparing to pivot his heavy gaze onto me, to ask the unthinkable. I could feel the familiar weight of duty settling onto my shoulders, that old, suffocating blanket of, "Be a good girl, Nora." I set the teacup down on the mahogany side table. It made a dull, final thud. I looked at Chloe. She was staring at me now, her expression a mix of defiance and pleading. She wanted me to fix it. She always wanted me to fix it. She wanted to run off with Colin and play house in his rented apartment, leaving me to deal with the wreckage of our family's reputation. In the last life, I had resented her for it. I had spent years wondering what she was doing, imagining her happy and free, while I sat in Gideon's sprawling, silent mansion. It wasn't until I was dying that I learned the truth. Colin had embezzled her trust fund, left her drowning in debt, and vanished. Chloe had ended up working 3 jobs, her beauty ruined by stress and cheap liquor. Too proud to beg Gideon for help, and too bitter to speak to me. She didn't know she was running toward a cliff, and I wasn't going to stop her. "I'll do it," I said. The words slipped out of my mouth, smooth and cold as river stones. The room went entirely still. The grandfather clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Chloe blinked, her mouth dropping open slightly. "What?" "I'll marry Gideon," I said, leaning back against the scratchy upholstery of the sofa. I crossed my legs, feeling the cheap fabric of my skirt brush against my knee. "Let Chloe have Colin. I'll take the Hayes contract." Mother let out a strangled gasp. "Nora, don't be ridiculous. He asked for Chloe. He asked for a bride from this family to secure the merger," I corrected mildly. "He doesn't care which one of us signs the paper. He needs a respectable marriage on paper to appease his board of directors after that scandal last month. I'm respectable. I'm quiet. I won't cause scenes." I watched my father's face. The cigar in his hand had gone out. He was doing the math in his head, a desperate, frantic calculation. I was less attractive than Chloe. I was less charming. But I was here. I was willing. And most importantly, I wouldn't run. "Are you sure, Nora?" my father asked. His voice was thick with guilt, but underneath it, I heard the undeniable note of relief. He was selling me, and he knew it, and he was glad I was making it easy for him. "I'm sure," I said. I looked at Chloe. She was staring at me as if I had sprouted a second head. There was relief in her eyes. Yes, but also a flicker of insult. How dare I step into the role she had deemed so horrific, so easily? How dare I not cry or tremble? "You're crazy," Chloe whispered. "He's going to eat you alive, Nora. You know that, right? He'll crush you." I offered her a small, closed-mouth smile. My heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm in my chest. Let him try. Gideon Hayes smelled like ozone, expensive wool, and stale black coffee. I sat across from him in his downtown office, a vast expanse of glass and steel that overlooked the gray sprawl of the city. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the lights into smeared streaks of yellow and red. The HVAC system hummed, a low, industrial vibration that I could feel in the soles of my sensible leather shoes. He hadn't looked up from his tablet since I walked in. He was exactly as I remembered him from this era. 32, sharply angled jaw, dark hair, perfectly in place, but graying slightly at the temples. He didn't have the rugged, chaotic charm of a romance protagonist. He looked like a man who worked 90-hour weeks and considered sleep a biological flaw. "Your father sent the amendment," Gideon said. His voice was a flat baritone, devoid of any inflection. He tapped a stylus against the glass screen. "Nora, instead of Chloe. Yes. Why? He finally looked up. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray. They weren't piercing or intense. They were just empty. It was the look of a man appraising a piece of machinery. In my past life, that gaze had made me want to fold in on myself, to hide my flaws. Now, I met it dead on. I felt nothing but a distant, clinical curiosity. Chloe is currently packing a suitcase to abscond with a man named Colin. I said evenly, if you force the issue, she will embarrass you at the altar. I will not. I require no courtship, no grand wedding, and no emotional investment from you. I will sign the prenuptial agreement as it stands, with one minor alteration. Gideon's hand paused. The stylus hovered over the tablet. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch. It was the closest thing to surprise I had ever seen him display. And why are you doing this? He asked. Martyrdom? Sisterly love? Pragmatism, I lied. Our family needs the money. I need a place to live that isn't suffocated by my mother's anxiety. You need a wife to make your board of directors forget that you allegedly drove your last business partner to a nervous breakdown. It's a mutually beneficial transaction. He stared at me for a long moment. I let him look. I didn't fidget. I didn't adjust my skirt. I didn't try to look prettier or softer. I just sat there, breathing in the smell of his sterile office, anchoring myself in the present. In the silence, my mind flashed back to a night 3 years into our marriage. I had burned my hand on the stove, making him dinner, a pathetic, desperate attempt to play the good wife. He had walked into the kitchen, looked at the blister forming on my skin, and said, "We employ a chef, Nora. Stop pretending to be useful in ways you aren't." I swallowed the bitter taste of the memory. He wasn't a monster who beat his wife. He was just a man completely devoid of empathy. He saw people as assets or liabilities. Last time, I had tried to be a person to him. This time, I would be an asset. A highly efficient, untouchable asset. What is the alteration to the agreement? He asked, dropping the stylus onto the desk. It made a sharp clack. I want a separate bank account, funded with a monthly stipend of $10,000, which you do not have oversight of, I said. And I want the deed to the small hunting cabin you own in the northern woods, in my name. Gideon narrowed his eyes. Planning an escape route before the ink is even dry? Planning for obsolescence, I corrected. I am aware that a marriage of convenience only lasts as long as it is convenient. When you inevitably decide you are tired of this arrangement, or when your board is satisfied and you file for a quiet divorce, I want a parachute. He leaned back in his leather chair. The leather creaked, a rich, heavy sound. He studied me, really studied me. For the first time, he was looking for the catch. He was looking for the hidden dagger. He wouldn't find one, because I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted to survive him. $10,000 a month is steep for a woman whose current wardrobe costs less than my watch, he noted dryly. You're paying for low maintenance, Mr. Hayes. High-quality machinery requires a premium. A beat of silence, then a sharp exhale through his nose. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. He picked up his desk phone and hit a single button. "Mary Ann," he said into the speaker, "bring in the amended contract and draft a deed transfer for the Blackwood. No, wait." He paused, looking at me. "The cabin in the pines. Have legal expedite it." He hung up. "We get married on Thursday," he said. "City Hall. Pack light. My housekeeper will purchase whatever you need once you move into the estate." "Understood," I said. I stood up, smoothing the front of my skirt. I'll see you Thursday, Gideon. I turned and walked out of the office. My legs felt a little weak, a residual tremor of adrenaline, but my spine was straight. I had just willingly stepped back into the cage that had killed me, but this time I held the key, and I knew exactly how many bars there were. The smell of cardboard and mothballs filled my small bedroom. I was packing. It didn't take long. 2 suitcases held the entirety of my 24 years on this earth. Faded sweaters, sensible skirts, a few pairs of slacks. I left the dresses my mother had bought me, the itchy, pastel things meant to make me look sweet and approachable, hanging in the closet. Down the hall, I could hear the frantic rustling of silk and the snapping of locks. Chloe was also packing. I taped up a small cardboard box of my books and pushed it toward the door. As I stood up, wiping dust from my hands, Chloe appeared in my doorway. She looked radiant. The fake tears from yesterday were entirely gone, replaced by a feverish, manic energy. She was wearing a trench coat over a designer slip dress, her hair pulled up in a messy, effortless bun that probably took her 40 minutes to achieve. "I'm leaving," she whispered, stepping into my room and closing the door behind her. "I know," I said. I didn't look at her. I went to my dresser and opened the top drawer, pulling out a pair of plain cotton socks. "Colin is waiting 2 blocks down in a cab. We're going to the city. He has a friend with a loft we can stay in until his investments pay out." She crossed her arms, watching me pack. There was a strange tension in her voice. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to beg her to stay, to tell her how brave she was, or perhaps to yell at her so she could feel righteous in her abandonment. "Drive safe," I said, tossing the socks into the suitcase. Chloe frowned. She stepped closer. Her perfume, that heavy, cloying jasmine, overpowering the smell of the mothballs. "Are you really going to do this, Nora? Marry him? You don't even know him." "I know he's going to clear Father's debts," I replied smoothly. "And I know I'll have a roof over my head." "You're selling yourself," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Pity. She was pitying me. It was almost laughable. I turned to face her. I looked at her flushed cheeks, her bright, naive eyes. She was 22, spoiled rotten, and completely oblivious to the cruelty of the world. She thought love, or whatever cheap imitation of it Colin was offering, was a shield. She didn't know that Colin would gamble away her jewelry by next Christmas. She didn't know she would spend her 25th birthday crying in a diner bathroom because she couldn't afford rent. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest, a ghost of sisterly affection. In my past life, I had mourned her disappearance. I had worried myself sick. Now, looking at her, I felt a heavy, cold resignation. I could warn her. I could tell her Colin was a fraud. But if I did, she would stay. The contract with Gideon would revert to her. History would snap back into its groove. And I would be right back where I started, the invisible sister, waiting for the axe to fall. I was selfish. I knew that now. Death had burned away my capacity for martyrdom. "I'm securing my future, Chloe," I said quietly. "You should worry about yours." She scoffed, tossing her head. "Colin loves me. We're going to build a real life, not a corporate merger." She reached out and awkwardly patted my shoulder. Her hand felt light, insubstantial. "I'm sorry, Nora. Truly. But I can't be a prisoner. I hope he isn't as bad as they say. Goodbye, Chloe." She lingered for a second longer, waiting for an absolution I wouldn't give her. Then she turned and slipped out the door. A minute later, I heard the subtle click of the back door shutting. She was gone. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension drain out of the room. The house felt instantly lighter, as if a localized atmospheric pressure had lifted. I zipped up my suitcase. Thursday arrived with a dreary, gray sky that threatened rain, but never quite delivered. City Hall was bleak. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the linoleum floors. Gideon stood by the magistrate's desk, checking his watch. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, but he looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. "You're late," he said, as I walked up. "Traffic on the I-95, I replied smoothly, setting my purse on a plastic chair. I was wearing a simple navy dress. No veil, no flowers. He didn't comment on my appearance. He just gestured to the paperwork. Sign here and here, initial the bottom. The magistrate, a bored-looking woman with thick glasses, mumbled through the standard vows. We didn't exchange rings. We didn't kiss. We just dragged blue ink across cheap paper, binding our lives together with all the romance of a real estate transaction. When it was done, Gideon picked up his briefcase. "My driver will take you to the estate. I have a board meeting in an hour. I won't be home until late." "Don't worry about me," I said, picking up my purse. He paused, looking at me. His gaze dropped to my left hand, bare of any jewelry, and then back up to my face. "You don't talk much, do you, Nora?" "Only when I have something to say." A muscle feathered in his jaw. For a second, I thought he might actually say something personal. But then the moment passed. The corporate mask slid back into place, and he turned away. "See you tonight." The drive to the Hayes estate took an hour. The car was a massive, silent, black sedan. The leather seats smelled like new money and chemical cleaner. I watched the city fade into sprawling suburbs, and then into deep, heavily wooded plots of land. The estate was a sprawling, modern monstrosity of glass, dark wood, and stone. It sat on a hill, surrounded by ancient oak trees that blocked out the sun. In my past life, this house had felt like a mausoleum. The sheer size of it had intimidated me, making me feel small and loud, no matter how quietly I walked. The driver carried my bags to the front door. Before he could ring the bell, the door swung open. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. She was a tall, severe woman, with hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. I remembered her well. She had treated me with polite contempt in the last timeline, viewing me as an uncultured gold digger who had trapped her employer. "Mrs. Hayes," she said. Her voice clipped. She didn't smile. "Nora," I corrected softly, stepping into the grand foyer. The marble floors echoed under my shoes. The air inside was cool, smelling heavily of beeswax and fresh lilies. "As you wish, ma'am. I will show you to your room." She started toward the massive, sweeping staircase, expecting me to follow meekly. "Mrs. Gable," I called out. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cavernous space. She stopped and turned, one eyebrow raised. "I prefer the guest suite on the east wing," I said, walking toward her. "The one with the adjoining sunroom. My bags can go there. And please have the lilies removed from the foyer. The smell gives me a migraine. White roses are fine. Or nothing at all." Mrs. Gable blinked. I saw the immediate recalculation in her eyes. I wasn't the trembling, terrified girl from the past timeline. I knew the layout of the house. I knew what I wanted. "Mr. Hayes usually has his wife in the master suite." She started to object. "Mr. Hayes and I have an understanding." I cut her off. my tone pleasant, but utterly unyielding. "The east wing, please. I will unpack myself." I didn't wait for her to agree. I walked past her, my cheap shoes clicking firmly on the imported marble. I was back in the cage, but as I walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward the east wing, trailing my fingers along the cold stone walls, a small, genuine smile touched my lips. This time, I was going to make the cage comfortable, and Gideon Hayes wouldn't know what hit him. The east wing smelled of old paper and dust. I liked it that way. It was a sterile, forgotten smell, entirely detached from the heavy, suffocating luxury of the rest of the estate. My first 3 days as Mrs. Gideon Hayes passed in near absolute silence. I didn't see my husband. I learned from a tight-lipped Mrs. Gable that he was sleeping at his downtown penthouse, finalizing the merger with my father's shipping company. I spent my time meticulously mapping out the boundaries of my new existence. I rearranged the furniture in the sunroom, dragging a heavy oak reading chair into the direct line of the morning light. I requested plain oatmeal and black coffee for breakfast, ignoring the elaborate spreads the chef tried to push on me. I wore my own clothes, faded denim, soft cotton sweaters that had seen better days. I was comfortable, but underneath the comfort, a low-grade hum of adrenaline vibrated in my jaw. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on Thursday night, exactly 1 week after our courthouse wedding. It was past midnight. I was sitting in the sunroom, wrapped in a thin wool blanket, reading a paperback thriller I'd found in the estate's massive library. The only light came from a brass floor lamp beside me. Rain lashed against the glass roof, a chaotic, drumming sound that usually helped me sleep. Then, the heavy oak door down the hall clicked open. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They didn't echo on the plush carpets, but I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. In my past life, the sound of Gideon's footsteps late at night meant one of 2 things. He was drunk and looking for an argument to bleed off his corporate stress, or he was coldly sober and coming to criticize some failure in my housekeeping. My chest tightened, my pulse spiked, a hard, erratic thumping against my ribs. It was a biological response, a ghost of the girl who had died on that wet asphalt. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. I tasted the dry, paper-scented air. I am not her, I reminded myself. I am the asset. The footsteps stopped at the entrance to the sunroom. I didn't look up from my book. I turned a page. The paper made a soft, rough sound. "Mrs. Gable informed me you commandeered the guest wing." Gideon's voice was rough with exhaustion. I finally looked over. He was standing in the doorway, loosening his silk tie. He smelled of scotch, expensive cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold rain. His hair was slightly damp, falling out of its usual rigid styling. "I didn't commandeer it," I replied, my voice steady. I marked my page and closed the book, setting it on the side table. "I requested it. It's practical. You keep erratic hours, and I am a light sleeper. This arrangement prevents us from disturbing one another." He stepped fully into the room. The shadows clung to the sharp angles of his face. He didn't look angry, exactly. He looked intensely curious, like a scientist observing an anomaly in a petri dish. "My wife is expected to sleep in my quarters," he said. He walked toward me, stopping just a few feet from my chair. He was tall enough that I had to crane my neck slightly to meet his eyes. "Your wife is expected to present a united front in public," I corrected him. "In private, I assume you prefer efficiency over tradition. We don't love each other, Gideon, Pretending to share a bed for the benefit of a housekeeper who already despises me seems like a waste of energy. He stared at me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rain hitting the glass above us. I kept my breathing even, refusing to break eye contact. The urge to look away, to shrink into the chair and apologize, clawed at my throat. I swallowed it down. Slowly, Gideon reached into his suit jacket. My heart gave a stupid, involuntary flutter, but he only pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and took a slow pull. "You're not what I expected," he said, lowering the flask. His breath caught the light of the lamp, a faint mist of alcohol and warmth. "I imagine you expected Chloe," I said flatly. "She would be crying right now, demanding to know why you haven't been home, throwing a vase at the wall, and then expecting you to buy her a diamond tennis bracelet to make up for it." A faint smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It was a harsh, cynical expression that completely transformed his face. "And you? What do you expect me to buy you?" "Nothing." I pulled the wool blanket a little tighter around my shoulders. "I expect you to pay the stipend we agreed upon on the 1st of the month. Beyond that, I require nothing from you." He took another sip from the flask, his eyes never leaving mine. "A low-maintenance wife. Careful, Nora. You're dangerously close to making me think you're actually useful." That was the pitch, wasn't it? He capped the flask and slipped it back into his jacket. He looked around the sunroom, taking in the rearranged furniture, the stack of library books on the floor, the absolute lack of personal touches or decorative fluff. "The board of directors is hosting a dinner party here next Friday," he said, turning back to me. His tone had shifted, becoming entirely transactional again. The brief moment of curiosity was gone. 40 guests, catered. You will need a dress." "I have dresses." "Not for this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black credit card. He tossed it onto the table next to my book. It landed with a sharp clack. "Mrs. Gable will arrange a personal shopper. Get something that makes you look like you belong to me." The phrasing made my stomach turn. A cold, oily feeling. Belong to me. I looked at the card. In my last life, I had taken it eagerly, thinking it was a peace offering. I had bought a sequined, gaudy thing that made me look like a cheap chandelier, and he had sneered at me all night. "I'll handle my own wardrobe," I said, leaving the card on the table. "Don't worry, Gideon. I won't embarrass you." He looked at the card, then back at me. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, a curt, dismissive gesture. "See that you don't," he murmured. He turned and walked away. I listened to his heavy footsteps fade down the hall, followed by the distant, solid thud of the master suite door closing. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding, my hands shaking just slightly as I picked my book back up. The dining room was stifling. It wasn't the temperature. The climate control was set to a perfect, crisp 70 degrees. It was the sheer density of wealth, ego, and expensive perfumes clashing in the enclosed space. The long mahogany table was set with heavy crystal and polished silver that caught the glare of the chandelier, creating sharp little daggers of light that made my eyes ache. I sat at the foot of the table. Gideon sat at the head, a vast expanse of white linen and floral centerpieces separating us. I was wearing black, no sequins, no plunging neckline. It was a tailored, floor-length silk crepe dress with long sleeves and a high boat neck. It cost a fraction of the budget Gideon had offered, but the cut was immaculate. It felt like armor. I wore no jewelry except my plain wedding band, and I had pinned my hair back in a severe, elegant twist. When I had walked down the stairs an hour earlier, Gideon had paused his conversation with the caterer to look at me. He hadn't smiled, but his eyes had tracked the clean lines of the dress with a slow, calculating approval. Asset secured, his look had said. Now we were deep into the second course. A bitter radicchio salad with shaved truffles that tasted like damp earth. To my right sat Richard Vance. No, Richard Hawthorne. I corrected myself mentally, filing away the names of Gideon's board members. Hawthorne was a fleshy, red-faced man in his 60s, who smelled overpoweringly of garlic and stale cigar smoke. He had spent the last 20 minutes ignoring me entirely, speaking over my head to the woman across from him about a recent golf tournament. In the previous timeline, I had shrunk into my chair during this dinner, terrified of using the wrong fork, desperate for anyone to smile at me. I had knocked over a water glass, and the resulting silence had been agonizing. Tonight, I ate my salad methodically. I didn't try to force conversation. I simply observed. "So, Nora," a voice boomed, cutting through the low murmur of the table. It was Hawthorne. He had finally turned his bloodshot eyes on me. The table quieted slightly. Several guests leaned in. They smelled blood in the water. Gideon's quick, quiet marriage had sparked rumors, and Hawthorne was known for his blunt, often cruel, interrogations. "Richard," I replied, setting my fork down. I didn't wipe my mouth. I hadn't spilled anything. I met his gaze with absolute, unblinking calm. "We were quite surprised when Gideon announced his marriage," Hawthorne said, swirling the red wine in his massive glass. He had a patronizing, oily smile, especially to the quieter sister of the family. "We all expected the vibrant Chloe. Tell me, how does a girl from a sinking shipping company adjust to running a ship like the Hayes Empire?" It was a blatant insult. He was calling my family bankrupt and implying I was out of my depth. Down at the other end of the table, I saw Gideon stiffen slightly. He didn't intervene. He was watching me, testing me. The silence in the room stretched tight. I could hear the faint, wet sound of someone chewing ice. I let the silence hang for a beat longer than was comfortable. I picked up my wine glass by the stem, feeling the cool crystal against my fingers. "I don't run the empire, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly down the length of the table. It was smooth, devoid of any defensive edge. Gideon employs a highly compensated executive team to do that. I simply manage the estate. Hawthorne chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "A glorified housekeeper, then. How quaint." A few of the wives snickered. I didn't flush. I didn't look down. I smiled. It was a small, precise curving of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. "I suppose you could call it that," I agreed, pleasantly, though I prefer to view it as quality control. For instance, ensuring that the people who sit at this table understand the basic tenets of modern business etiquette. I took a slow sip of my wine, maintaining eye contact. It's a demanding job, but necessary. After all, if a board member can't navigate a simple social dinner without attempting to leverage a host's wife for cheap entertainment, one has to wonder how they handle complex negotiations under actual pressure. The snickering stopped instantly. The silence that fell over the room this time was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Hawthorne's red face turned a dangerous shade of purple. His mouth opened, but he couldn't seem to find the words. I had just politely, publicly, called him incompetent. I set my wine glass down. The soft clink echoed like a gavel. "But to answer your original question, Richard," I continued smoothly, picking my fork back up, The adjustment has been seamless. Gideon and I value efficiency. Now I believe the chef is preparing a Wagyu beef for the main course. Shall we discuss something more appetizing? Hawthorne closed his mouth. He looked furious, but he was trapped. If he argued, he proved my point about his lack of etiquette. He gave a stiff, jerky nod and aggressively returned to his radicchio. The tension broke as other guests hurriedly resumed their conversations, eager to pretend the execution hadn't just happened. I took a bite of a truffle. It still tasted like dirt. I casually glanced down the table toward Gideon. He wasn't talking to the woman next to him. He was staring directly at me. His pale gray eyes were sharp, bright, and intensely focused. The bored, corporate mask was entirely gone. He raised his wine glass just an inch off the table, holding my gaze. A silent, deeply appreciative salute. I didn't acknowledge it. I turned my attention to the empty plate in front of me, feeling the cool silk of my dress against my skin. I had won the skirmish, but as I felt the heavy weight of Gideon's continued stare burning into the side of my face, I realized I might have made a catastrophic error. I had wanted to be an invisible asset, but tonight I had just made myself interesting to a predator. The caterers were gone by 1 a.m. The estate settled into a heavy, bruised silence, smelling faintly of roasted meat, extinguished beeswax candles, and spilled claret. I sat on the edge of the clawfoot tub in my bathroom, staring at the white, hexagonal tiles on the floor. My scalp throbbed. I reached up, my fingers clumsy with fatigue, and pulled the tight metal grips from my hair. They hit the porcelain sink with sharp, metallic pings. 1, 2, 3. With every pin removed, a fraction of the tension in my skull released, but the knot in my stomach remained pulled tight. I had been stupid. Survival in the Hayes house required blending into the wallpaper. In my past life, my sheer terror had done that for me. This time, my arrogance had painted a target on my back. I turned on the cold water tap, letting it run over my wrists. The freezing temperature shocked my pulse, slowing the frantic, rabbit-like flutter of my heart. A floorboard creaked in the adjoining sunroom. I froze, the water still rushing over my skin. I hadn't locked the door to the east wing. I reached for a hand towel, drying my wrists with slow, deliberate movements. When I walked out of the bathroom, Gideon was standing by the large windows. He had taken off his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of his throat. He looked out at the pitch-black grounds, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't turn around when I entered. "Hawthorne is going to demand an audit of the shipping merger just to spite you." "Let him," I said, staying near the bathroom doorway. "The books are clean. If he wastes board resources on a vendetta, it proves he's emotional and reactionary. You can use it to force an early retirement." Gideon finally turned. The ambient light from the hallway caught the harsh angles of his face. He looked at me, really looked at me, the way a butcher looks at a particularly complex cut of meat. "You planned that," he stated. "It wasn't a question." "I reacted to an insult," I corrected flatly. "I don't plan anything, Gideon. I simply prefer not to be a stepping stone for a man whose breath smells like rotting onions." He let out a short, low breath, a laugh, stripped of any humor. He began to cross the room toward me. My body betrayed me. A sudden, icy spike of adrenaline flooded my veins. My muscles coiled. I wanted to step backward, to put the heavy mahogany door between us. I forced my feet to stay planted. I dug my fingernails into the fabric of the towel I was still holding. He stopped, less than 2 feet away. He was too close. The smell of him, scotch, dry cleaned wool, and that underlying scent of cold rain, was overwhelming. You sat in my office a week ago and sold yourself as a silent, compliant asset, he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. You said you wouldn't cause scenes. I didn't cause a scene. I ended one. You castrated my oldest board member in front of 30 people without raising your voice. Gideon tilted his head, his pale gray eyes tracing the line of my jaw, down to my collarbone, and back up. Who are you, Nora? I am exactly who you married. No, you aren't. He reached out. I didn't flinch, though every nerve ending screamed at me to move. His fingers didn't touch my skin. He caught a loose strand of hair that had fallen across my shoulder, rubbing the dark strands between his thumb and forefinger. It was a terrifyingly intimate gesture from a man who didn't possess a heart. Your sister is a predictable, greedy little creature. Your father is a coward. Your mother is a hysteric. But you're something else entirely. I looked up at him. The sheer, physical presence of the man was suffocating. I remembered the way he had ignored my tears in the past, the way his coldness had slowly starved me to death. He wasn't warming up to me now. He was dissecting me. I am a pragmatist, I said. My voice was steady, even though my lungs felt tight. I want peace. I want the stipend. I want the cabin in the woods. If you leave me alone, I will leave you alone. He dropped the strand of hair. His hand fell back to his side. The intensity in his eyes didn't waver. I don't think you want peace, Gideon said softly. I think you're bored, and I think you're holding your breath. He stepped back, breaking the invisible, suffocating tether between us. He turned toward the door. Sleep well, Nora, he said over his shoulder. Try not to dismantle the rest of my company while I'm at the office tomorrow. The door clicked shut. I stood there for a long time, listening to the heavy silence of the house rush back in. My hands were shaking. I threw the towel onto the floor, angry at him, but mostly angry at myself. I had wanted to build a cage I could comfortably ignore. Instead, I had just handed the warden the keys and dared him to look inside. November arrived with a brutal, biting cold that stripped the oak trees bare. The estate grounds turned into a skeletal landscape of gray and brown. Inside, my routine with Gideon had settled into a tense, vibrating stalemate. We rarely spoke, but he was always watching. If I read in the library, I would find him standing in the doorway 15 minutes later, supposedly looking for a file, but his eyes would linger on the title of my book. If I ate in the kitchen to avoid the dining room, he would suddenly decide to take his morning coffee at the Butcher Block Island, standing in silence while I chewed my toast. He was hunting, waiting for me to slip up and reveal whatever it was he thought I was hiding. The crack in the ice didn't come from him. It came from a ringing telephone on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the sunroom, cataloging a stack of antique botanical prints, when Mrs. Gable appeared. She held a cordless handset out to me like it was a soiled napkin. "Your mother, ma'am," she said, her mouth a thin, disapproving line. I stared at the phone. A cold dread, heavy and thick as sludge, pooled in my stomach. I hadn't spoken to my family since the wedding. I took the receiver, waiting until Mrs. Gable's sensible heels clicked away down the hall before pressing it to my ear. "Hello, Mother." "Oh, Nora, thank God," Beatrice's voice was a frantic, wet gasp. She was crying. The sound immediately transported me back to the parlor, to the smell of burnt sugar and fake jasmine. I tasted copper in the back of my mouth. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I already knew. The timeline was asserting itself. "It's Chloe," she sobbed, the phone line crackling with static. "She called me from a payphone in the city. Oh, Nora, it's awful. That boy, Colin, he lost his job. He invested her trust fund in some terrible scheme, and it's all gone. Every penny. They're being evicted from their apartment on Friday." I closed my eyes, the botanical print in front of me, a beautifully detailed sketch of a belladonna plant. Blurred. In my past life, this was the point where I hadn't known what was happening. I had been trapped in this house, isolated, wondering why my sister never called. Now, I knew exactly what was unfolding. Colin hadn't lost his job. He never had one. The investment scheme was an illegal poker ring in the basement of a slaughterhouse. "Tell her to come home," I said, my voice dead and flat. "Your father won't allow it," Mother wailed. "You know his pride. She embarrassed him by running off. He says she made her bed, but she's sleeping on an air mattress, Nora. She has a terrible cough." She paused, drawing a jagged breath. "You have to ask Gideon." I opened my eyes. The belladonna came back into sharp focus. "Ask Gideon what? For a loan. Just 20,000. Just to get them back on their feet. You're his wife, Nora. He'll listen to you. We can't let her starve." A sickening wave of nausea washed over me. The sheer, towering audacity of it. My parents had sold me to a man they believed to be a monster, just to save their own skin. And now they wanted me to beg that same monster to fund the sister who had abandoned me to the fire. The worst part was the small, pathetic, broken part of my soul that wanted to say yes. The part of me that remembered Chloe as a little girl with scraped knees. The part of me that had been conditioned for 2 decades to fix my family's messes. "I am not a hero," I reminded myself. The thought felt like swallowing broken glass. "I am surviving." No, the word dropped into the phone line like a stone into a deep well. "What?" Mother's crying hitched, stopping abruptly. I said no. I will not ask Gideon for money for Colin. My grip on the plastic handset was so tight, my knuckles ached. Chloe chose Colin. She chose to leave. I paid her debt by marrying Gideon. I don't owe her anything else. "Nora!" The shock in her voice morphed instantly into venom. "How can you be so cruel? She is your flesh and blood. You sit up there in your mansion, in your designer clothes, while your sister is out on the street." "Yes," I said. My voice was a whisper. It was the ugliest sound I had ever made. "You selfish, spiteful little..." I hit the red button on the handset. The line went dead. I set the phone on the table. My hands were shaking violently now. The room felt too hot, the air too thin. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to force back the hot, stinging pressure of tears. I hated them. I hated Colin. I hated Chloe for being stupid. But mostly, I hated myself for how easy it was to let her drown. Fascinating. I dropped my hands, whipping around. Gideon was leaning against the doorframe of the sunroom. He was holding a crystal tumbler with a single cube of ice and 2 fingers of amber liquid. He had heard the entire thing. "How long have you been standing there?" I demanded, my voice cracking slightly. I hated the weakness in it. "Long enough to realize I married a woman with ice in her veins," he said. taking a slow sip of his drink. He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room. He didn't look angry or disgusted. He looked genuinely impressed. "Go away, Gideon." He ignored me, stopping on the other side of the table. He looked down at the dead phone, then up at my face. I knew I looked a mess, pale, wide-eyed, stripped of my usual armor. Most wives in your position would have come crying to me, begging for the cash, he mused, swirling the ice in his glass. Or, more likely, they would have tried to siphon it out of the household accounts quietly. I told you I wouldn't be a liability. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, trying to hold myself together. You let your sister hit the pavement, he observed softly. His pale eyes searched mine, digging into the raw, bleeding guilt I was trying so hard to hide. Does it hurt? I glared at him. I am protecting my position. I didn't ask what you were protecting, he countered, stepping around the table. He was close again, the smell of scotch and wool. I asked if it hurt to cut the dead weight loose. I looked up at his cold, flawless face. He was a man who cut dead weight every day. He fired people, liquidated companies, tore apart legacies without blinking. He was offering me a twisted sort of validation. He was telling me that ruthlessness was acceptable. Yes, I whispered. The truth slipped out before I could stop it. It hurts. Gideon stared at me. For a fraction of a second, the mechanical emptiness in his eyes fractured. He reached out, and this time, his knuckles brushed lightly against the side of my neck, just below my jaw. His skin was freezing cold. It stops hurting eventually, he said. He pulled his hand back, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the silence, the belladonna, and the terrifying realization that Gideon Hayes understood me better than anyone else in the world. December brought a wet, miserable cold that sank into the limestone bones of the estate. The sky was a perpetual bruised purple, and sleet constantly hit the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. I was in the kitchen, pouring a cup of black coffee, when the intercom on the wall buzzed. Mrs. Gable answered it. Her spine went rigid, and her mouth pinched into a tight, white line. She hung up and turned to me. "There is a vagrant at the service gate," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with disgust. "The security guard says she is demanding to see you. She claims to be your sister." I set the coffee pot down. The heavy glass hit the granite counter with a dull thud. "Have him open the gate," I said. "Bring her to the mudroom." "Ma'am." Mr. Hayes strictly forbade. "Bring her to the mudroom, Mrs. Gable." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The housekeeper glared at me, but she pressed the intercom button and relayed the order. I walked down the long, narrow corridor that led to the back of the house. The mudroom smelled of damp wool, boot polish, and wet dog. A minute later, the heavy metal door opened, letting in a blast of freezing wind. Chloe stumbled inside. I barely recognized her. The radiant, untouchable girl who had packed her bags in a silk slip dress was gone. She wore a stained puffer jacket that was 3 sizes too big. Her hair was matted to her skull by the sleet. She smelled of stale cigarette smoke, unwashed skin, and cheap, sugary alcohol. She looked up at me. Her lips were blue. She was shivering so violently her teeth audibly clicked together. "Nora," she croaked. I didn't move toward her. I stood with my hands in the pockets of my heavy cardigan, feeling the rough knit against my knuckles. "Where is Colin?" "Gone." Chloe let out a wet, rattling cough, wrapping her arms around her thin torso. He left 2 weeks ago. Took the rest of the cash. I've been sleeping in a subway station for 3 days, Nora. Mother said you wouldn't help, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. She took a step forward, reaching out a shaking, filthy hand toward me. In my last life, I would have pulled her into my arms. I would have drawn her a hot bath, given her my clothes, and begged Gideon to let her stay. I would have sacrificed my own fragile peace to glue her broken pieces back together. But I looked at her now, and all I felt was a profound, suffocating exhaustion. You can't stay here, I said. Chloe froze. Her hand dropped. The desperation in her eyes hardened into a jagged, frantic panic. Nora, please, it's freezing out there. I'm sick. I'm your sister. You made your choice, Chloe. You chose a fantasy, and you left me to pay the bill. My voice was flat, devoid of the anger I thought I would feel. It was just the truth, cold and solid as the slate floor beneath our feet. This house is not a sanctuary. It's a transaction, and you are not part of the contract. You're a monster, she whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. You're just as bad as him. You've let this place turn you into a psychopath. No, I corrected softly. I just stopped being a martyr. I pulled my right hand out of my pocket. I held a crisp, white envelope. I stepped forward and held it out to her. She stared at it, then snatched it from my fingers. She ripped the flap open. Inside was a cashier's check for $10,000, exactly 1 month of the stipend I had bled from Gideon. That is from my personal account, I said. It is enough for a bus ticket out of the state, a security deposit on a cheap apartment, and groceries for 2 months. It is the absolute last thing I will ever give you. If you come to this gate again, I will have the guards arrest you for trespassing. Chloe stared at the check. Her hands were shaking so badly the paper fluttered like a trapped moth. She looked back up at me, her mouth working silently. She wanted to hurl the money in my face to preserve her pride, but hunger was a louder voice than dignity. She shoved the envelope deep into the pocket of her oversized coat. She didn't say, "Thank you." She just turned around, pushed the heavy metal door open, and walked back out into the freezing sleet. The door slammed shut. The latch clicked. I stood in the quiet mudroom, staring at the frost creeping up the small window pane. My chest felt hollowed out, scraped clean by a rusty spoon. It was done. I had finally severed the rotten limb. A messy amputation. A low voice noted from the shadows. I turned. Gideon stepped out of the dim hallway. He was wearing dark slacks and a charcoal sweater, holding a mug of black coffee. He had watched the entire exchange. It was necessary to prevent an infection, I replied. My voice shook slightly, betraying the adrenaline crashing in my system. Gideon walked toward me. He stopped in front of me, his height casting a long shadow over my face. He looked at the frost on the door, then down at my pale, trembling hands. Slowly, deliberately, he transferred his coffee mug to his left hand. With his right hand, he reached out and wrapped his warm, dry fingers around my freezing wrist. He didn't pull me into a hug. He didn't offer empty platitudes about family. He just held my wrist, his thumb pressing firmly against my erratic, racing pulse, anchoring me to the physical world. 10,000 was generous, he murmured, his thumb stroking a slow, steady rhythm over my vein. You're a harsh creditor, Nora. I learned from the best. The corner of his mouth twitched. He let go of my wrist, the sudden absence of his heat leaving my skin cold. He took a sip of his coffee and walked back down the hall. I stood there for a long time, the smell of his dark roast coffee lingering in the damp air, realizing that for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I wasn't entirely alone in the dark. Spring arrived with a violent thunderstorm that rattled the glass in the East Wing sunroom. It was exactly 1 year since I had signed the marriage certificate in that bleak courthouse. I was sitting in my oak reading chair, a heavy textbook on architecture resting on my lap, when Gideon's personal assistant called my cell phone. Mr. Hayes requested my presence in his home office. The walk down the hall felt longer than usual. The estate was quiet, the staff having retreated to their quarters to avoid the storm. Gideon's office smelled of expensive leather, lemon oil, and old paper. The only light came from a green glass banker's lamp on his massive mahogany desk. He was sitting behind it, wearing a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. As I walked in, he closed a leather-bound ledger and pushed it to the side. "Sit," he said. I sat in one of the heavy wingback chairs opposite him. I kept my back straight, crossing my ankles. Gideon reached into his top drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the center of the desk. It landed with a heavy, final smack. "The shipping merger finalized yesterday morning," he said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Your father's board was dissolved. The assets are fully integrated into Hayes Corp. The public transition period is over." I looked at the envelope. My heart executed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "I see. Inside that envelope are the divorce papers," Gideon continued, leaning back in his chair. His pale gray eyes were unreadable in the dim light. "I've already signed them. They cite irreconcilable differences. Quiet, clean, no fault." I stared at the thick beige paper. The texture of it looked rough, abrasive. "And the settlement?" I asked. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. "Generous," he said. "A lump sum of $5 million, transferred to your private account by Friday. And the deed to the cabin in the northern woods. It's fully winterized. You could leave tonight. You'd never have to see me or your family or this city again." This was it. This was the parachute I had demanded on day 1. It was the escape hatch I had built with my own 2 hands. The cage door was swinging wide open. I had survived him. I had secured my independence. I reached out and placed my hand flat on top of the envelope. The paper was cool. I thought about the cabin, the silence of the woods, the safety of being entirely alone, untouchable, with enough money to never worry again. And then I thought about the crushing, echoing emptiness of a life lived entirely on the defensive. I looked up at Gideon. He was watching my hand on the envelope. There was a tension in his jaw, a rigidness in his shoulders that hadn't been there a minute ago. He was waiting for me to take it and walk out the door. He expected me to run. Everyone ran from him eventually. $5 million, I mused softly, dragging my fingernail across the manila flap. It made a faint scratching sound. "That's a steep payout for a quiet asset. You earned it." Did I? I picked the envelope up. It was heavy. I weighed it in my hands, feeling the physical manifestation of my freedom. Then I leaned forward and dropped the envelope into the polished brass trash can beside his desk. It hit the bottom with a hollow, metallic clang. Gideon went perfectly still. His eyes snapped up to mine, the calculated emptiness shattering completely. "What are you doing, Nora?" His voice was a dangerous, low rasp. Renegotiating, I said smoothly. I settled back into my chair, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. The cabin is too remote, and $5 million is a severance package. I am not resigning. Gideon stared at me, his chest rising and falling in a sudden, sharp breath. The contract is fulfilled. You have your out. You wanted to survive this. I did survive it, I countered, holding his intense, burning gaze. I survived my family. I survived the ghost of my sister's choices. And I survived you. But I find that survival is incredibly boring. I stood up. I walked around the edge of the heavy mahogany desk, stopping just inches from his chair. He didn't pull away. He looked up at me, a complex matrix of shock, suspicion, and a dark, twisted kind of reverence swimming in his pale eyes. You're a ruthless, cold man, Gideon, I said quietly. The smell of rain and ozone wrapping around us in the dim office. You see the world as a balance sheet, but you are the only person who looks at me and sees exactly what I am. Without demanding, I soften the edges. You're broken, he whispered. And you're empty, I replied. It makes us highly efficient. I reached down and closed the laptop sitting on his desk. The soft click severed his connection to the outside world, leaving only the two of us in the quiet room. The arrangement remains mutually beneficial, I told him, my voice steady, anchored in absolute certainty. I am not packing a suitcase. I am not running to the woods. I am Mrs. Hayes, and I am keeping my position. Gideon looked at the closed laptop, then up at me. Slowly, a genuine smile broke across his face. It wasn't cynical or cruel. It was the terrifying, brilliant smile of a predator who had finally found his match in the dark. He reached out, his warm fingers wrapping firmly around my wrist, pulling me just a fraction closer. All right, Nora, he murmured, the sound vibrating in the quiet room. Let's see what we can build in the dark. If Nora's calculated survival and Gideon's twisted understanding kept you glued to the screen, this is the exact kind of dark, psychological storytelling we love to build. No cliché rescues, just two ruthless survivors choosing their own grim reality. Drop a like if you respect Nora for throwing away the parachute and claiming her empire. Share this story with someone who appreciates a protagonist with ice in her veins. And subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, unapologetic narratives. You won't want to miss what we create next.